I'm Dorothy Mullen. I am sitting here with Nancy, who's holding the camera, and George Scott. And I invited Nancy and George here today because I want to take a look at this question of how does our family narrative, our personal experience in childhood affect not just our relationships with people, but also our relationships with food. I first got interested in this because 14 years ago, when I first started running suppers meetings, I noticed very early on that we had a disproportionately high number of Jewish women in the diabetes meetings. And one day I looked around the table and said, there are like 8 people at this table and I am the only one who isn't Jewish. So I thought, well, I'm going to continue to watch and see what I can learn with this, but it seemed very clear that it had something to do with things other than they really like sweets or, the usual things we think about in terms of how we develop diabetes. This may be sounding familiar to you. Then a few years fast forward, we're running meetings at the suppers programs for people who have emotional eating issues. And this time I'm looking around the table and saying, I am the only person at the table who is not describing some serious pain in childhood or something that's really become a part of the story that we tell when we're explaining ourselves. And what's going on with all of the women in the emotional eater suppers groups. And again, it's in their stories somehow. So one day, you'll be much more familiar with this than I am, George. I saw a TED Talk by Nadine Burke-Harris, who does research out in the San Francisco Bay Area on adverse childhood experiences and how these adverse experiences before the age of 18, right? That's what the survey does.
Birth to 18.
A birth to 18 can affect people's health outcomes, mental health outcomes, likelihood of becoming addictive, right, and engaging in risky behaviors. So I'm going to bring George into the picture now and ask if you can just name what these questions are that on the survey for adverse childhood experiences.
Sure, love to. It's really interesting. The reason that this all began was because of obesity.
Ah, okay.
CDC.
I learned.
CDC and Kaiser Permanente had 2 researchers, and they speculated whether or not environment had a negative effect on obesity, not just food intake, but the toxicity of the environment. So they did the research, and they interviewed 17,000 people, mostly middle class, mostly college educated, mostly white. And what they found is, and what they created were a list of 10 questions, yes, no questions, that seem to lead us to understand that the more adverse experiences we have as kids, the more our neurology and biology is affected, and therefore the more our behavior is affected. So that was kind of the beginning, and here are the 10. And when you think about them, it kind of makes sense. So the first one they talk about is chronic humiliation. That you live in a family where, in fact, there were put downs and insults, and you always felt verbally threatened. The second one is, did you live in a family or a nest where there was physical hurt? Did somebody push you or slap you, throw something at you? Then we move into, so there are the 2 abuses, then we move into the sexual abuse. Prior to age 18, did someone at least 5 years older than you touch you, fondle you, attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? They are the first 3. Then they move into this area of, did you grow up in a family where you didn't feel you were important or you didn't feel you were special? And then we get into the area of neglect. We move then into, did you grow up in a family where there was substance abuse in the house, either through alcoholism or through street drugs? What's the possibility, yes or no, did you grow up where there was mental illness in the family? And if so, perhaps you saw that in terms of a suicide attempt or actual suicide in the family. Did you bear witness to the maternal figure in the home being abused? Because what we know is bearing witness to horror or bearing witness to bad things happening to other people affects the way our body responds to it. Another one is, did you grow up in a family where someone went to jail or someone went to prison? Because it speaks to that kind of tension in the family. So there were a total of 10 of those. And the significance is 4. The marker is 4. 4 or more, there seems to be this deterioration in outcomes for both physical health and mental health.
Okay, and at this point, the 17,000 are still middle-class people.
College educated.
College
white.
educated. And can you speak to, okay, so now Nadine Burke-Harris is looking at what's happening. I recall her talking about ADD, ADHD, and she said, but this isn't really what the diagnosis is, because if you change the environment of the child, and if you address these early experiences effectively, the kid doesn't have ADD, ADHD. The child is a logical product of the environment in which he or she has grown up. So
there are 2 great examples of that. That's a classic, because one of the things we do in our country more than anybody else is we medicate when we diagnose. And therefore, if we're able to change the environment or have teachers and parents understand why the behavior and they make adjustments to parenting, you'll see a change in the behavior. Therefore, it doesn't look like ADHD. Therefore, you don't get a referral to the doctor for medication. The other area that's classic and is becoming more and more true is gut problems. Right? So if you watch TV, pharmaceuticals are pushing gut medication, Linzess, Pepto-Bismol, Tums. But the same thing applies to the ADHD. If you change the environment around the child, gut takes care of itself. And therefore you don't have those kinds of issues.
Yeah, that's probably a cortisol mediated thing. It's so stress related. So what I'm seeing is a trajectory that if you simply medicate without changing the child's environment, or you treat in a way that doesn't deal with the family history, that the person just becomes wider and wider separated from whatever the real cause of the health, mental health, or addiction issues are, because it's never been addressed at the level at which it really
in part
began.
Because it's not understood.
It's not understood. And how would we ever understand it if we are just medicating it away?
Exactly.
Okay.
Now the other thing that's really interesting is it's intergenerational. So the book is called It Doesn't Start With You. It's not about these kids, it's about the ACEs score of the parents, which is about the ACEs score of the grandparents.
Okay.
Right? So that's part of the legacy that comes down through families, that we have to intervene in order to change the trajectory of that.
Okay. And that's probably my sensitivity to having so many children and grandchildren of Holocaust victims. This is an
This
expression
inherent
of that.
oppression, it's carried genetically or DNA, but it can be changed by the changing of the environment.
So can you talk about some of the specifics in terms of predictive health and mental health outcomes? What are we going to see in children who have these scores over 4 on the ACE test?
Here's what the data suggests. If you have a score of 4 or more, it suggests that the likelihood of classified depression goes up 46 times.
Wait, 46 times? Not percent, 46 times. Note that, wow.
It also says that if you have a score of 4 or more, you have a 200% greater likelihood of heart disease when you hit middle age.
And we assume that's also a stress cortisol mediated
cortisol,
thing.
right?
Okay.
That is inherent in the body. The body holds it. The book is called The Body Keeps the Score, right? We also know, and I think this is what really got my work into this, is that if you have a score or more, the chances of you considering suicide goes up 1,200% in a lifetime, because you're unable to manage the feelings, and you try and you cope in a variety of ways, including alcohol, including drugs, including self-injury, but none of that really sustains.
Okay, so there's that trajectory again. So many more things are going to go wrong if you don't deal with it when you're closer to them.
Absolutely true. Okay. So what we've started to do is to offer parent trainings on this, where they get aha moments. And a real big one is teachers, because if we create sanctuaries for kids where teachers' reaction responses are different than traditional, then kids are able to stay in their bodies, the prefrontal cortex works better, they feel better, therefore they do better.
Right, feels better and wires sooner for adult decision making.
Absolutely does.
Okay.
Interesting story about Nadine Burke-Harris.
Yes.
She was just appointed Surgeon General for the state of
California.
So therefore, we know that if we keep an eye on California over the next few years, they're going to do some amazing things around ACEs and well-being.
All right. So, and describe who's the we. You said we're dealing with these issues now. The we is the people in the profession. Like, what's your degree or discipline?
Yeah, so I began as a special educator. So I did my 30 years as an educator in special education, and now I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. So I have a foot in both of these worlds. One is, let's not make it too clinical sounding. There are things we can do as educators. But at the same time, when we have folks come to the practice, we're really interested in mom and dad's ACEs score because it probably will indicate how they're parenting, and then we can make changes there.
Okay, so this is going to show up in the practices and work lives of social workers,
Yes.
teachers,
Yes.
counselors, medical doctors,
Yes.
school nurses. Who else is going to be seeing and might misdiagnose, or if they're not informed about ACEs, they might make wrong assumptions about, oh, the kid has ADD or ADHD, or oh, the child has whatever, a budding eating disorder or something. Where are we likely to see these problems crop up?
Well, here's part of the dilemma, and I love the idea that you're filming this, because the medical profession, in spite of the fact that the two doctors who created ACEs were medical people,
right? Medical people.
The medical profession does not really screen for it, and part of that is because their training is around diagnosis, DSM-5 diagnoses, and medication, and it's hard to break in.
Right. So a pediatrician now has
Yes.
on his or her list of things to ask: how many glasses of milk do you drink a day, and does mommy or daddy smoke around you? You're
Yep.
saying, like, as routinely as we ask how many glasses of milk do you drink every day, we want to know.
And here's the way, I'm going to borrow this from Nadine Burke-Harris's work. If you listen to what the 10 categories are, and you ask somebody to fill out a paper and give it to you, they're not going to be honest.
Right.
The behavior is just too
Right.
embarrassing,
Right.
too humiliating.
Right.
But we don't need to know which ones. We only need to know a number, because in the data, they all distributed about equally among all 10. It doesn't matter the combination.
Whether it was incarceration
Doesn't
or
matter.
Okay.
So what we say then is, listen, here are the 10 questions. What number are yeses for you?
Right.
That's all we need.
That is so civilized.
Isn't it amazing?
What a kind way to go about it.
It is.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you some questions about the troubled relationships that we see in suppers meetings that relate to this, potentially, not just relationships with people, but relationships with food. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the biochemistry of stress and how these things just go off on their own once it gets started. So I'll begin. I have this theory that there are portals of entry into all forms of pathology. And if you, let's say we started with obesity, right? And diabetes is very close. You could have a portal of entry that just starts with stress and cortisol, and what do we do to eat? To comfort ourselves, we start eating. Or you could start with a family history of diabetes, and that's your portal of entry into this disease process. And so there's a family predisposition. You could start from the point of view of, not sleeping well and having sleep apnea. Now all of a sudden the cortisol rises.
Correct.
And you're just producing more stress hormones. And one of the fastest, easiest, cheapest ways to deal with that is to eat for comfort.
Yeah.
So there are many portals of entry, but once you get into that disease process where there's this self-reinforcing use of food to comfort yourself, and this is, I think we're seeing a lot of this at suppers now, the thing that underlies it all is that the stress hormones are the same, whether you're attacked by the proverbial saber-toothed tiger,
Doesn't matter.
or it doesn't matter. Cortisol is cortisol. Adrenaline is adrenaline.
Correct.
Once you're in that cycle, you have to comfort.
Yeah. If the bear lives in the house,
And if the bear lives in the house,
right?
Right.
Then kids' systems take over. This is not because they're choosing to be bad, they're choosing to misbehave. They are always on a survival, reactive, cortisol-driven system of survival. And once we understand that, we can actually not be punitive.
Right.
We can actually allow them time to calm. We can walk with them to calm. We can do meditation with them to calm. So once their body calms, their mind calms, the prefrontal cortex clicks in, now we got a learner there that we can help.
Right.
Regardless of their age.
Right. Yeah, and we haven't said enough about education outcomes as well.
And it reminded me, there was another point that you had made.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I know. As human beings, I think it's fair to say that we're pain aversive. We will do whatever we have to do, not what we choose to do, in order not to feel either physical or emotional pain.
Right.
In many ways, when you talk about comfort, comfort is the antithesis of that, right? I want to be comfortable, full of comfort. I don't want to be painful, full of pain. So it drives our choices and it drives our behavior with no thought behind it. It's just seeking comfort.
Okay, now I'm going to bring it around to suppers a little bit because in our community we are serving people who have all kinds of problems related to eating processed foods. And let's go through the list. We see problem relationship with food in people who have diabetes, autoimmune diseases.
Big.
Virtually all of the autoimmune diseases are related to inflammation, so much of which can be improved by learning which are the inflammatory foods and which are the anti-inflammatory foods, and then avoiding the ones that set you up into flames and drive those adrenal stress hormones, and which are the ones that you can often calm down. Now, in my experience, people who are highly stressed are not craving salmon and Brussels sprouts.
Correct.
What are they most likely to crave and comfort with?
Well, most likely high fats and lots of sugars.
High fats and lots of sugars.
Right. Anything that's convenient, lots of carbs, anything that's convenient. And we see it in our kids. Breakfast is a can of Coke and a bag of chips on the way to school.
That's very scary.
Right. So I bring it back to kids because we, through your work, can influence the adults, the kids benefit. And if the kids' system changes, they feel better about who they are because their performance goes up even in school.
Okay, so parents, clean your fingernails before you start pointing at your children.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
Absolutely true.
Right.
Absolutely true.
I'm going to just throw in another point that I haven't really figured out with George exactly how this is relevant, but it's not just about the cortisol and the blood sugar. There are other ways in just the neural cascade of pleasure, the dopamine cascade, where we can enter with food. Like, for example, one of the things I've been teaching when I'm invited back to TCNJ is that natural benzodiazepines occur in certain foods. Natural opiates occur in certain foods. The sugars in the corn syrup operate on the same pathways as the cocaine. So once you deal with this anticipation that you're going to experience comfort by eating, now you are solidly in that cycle of disease process, because now you have the cheap, easy, convenient thing that's going to pull you out. And unfortunately, one of the most compelling ones is withdrawal symptoms from which you get comfort if you eat the pizza or the ice cream or whatever it is. So let me bring it around to the suppers community. We build our meetings and our programs on helping people who must turn around their diet and lifestyle in order to deal with the whole list of health, mental health, and addictions issues. And I'm wondering if George can help us describe how a community where we cook together and eat together can benefit people whose food choices and habits around food are really driven by their history and their family narrative.
So there are two parts to that: how to help people understand that backstory.
Right.
And also, the first thing that came to mind for me was, because attachment is a human necessity, and we know that, and we haven't even talked about in utero cortisol and adrenaline,
Right.
and how it affects that developing baby. But attachment is so critical that when you build community among a common direction, everybody feels connected, and there's comfort in that. So you don't need the comfort specifically in food, you get comfort in relationships.
Right. It just doesn't happen as fast as
Exactly.
buttered popcorn.
Right. Or taking pills.
Right. Or taking pills.
Right. Or smoking marijuana.
Right.
So we know that, and we know why kids do it, because it works. Well, can we substitute out something that gives them a bigger payoff going down the road? So that's one of the things that I think about in terms of the environment of suppers. The other thing is this issue of a shared story. Sometimes the history, your personal history, actually separates you because of the shame and embarrassment. But now all of a sudden you find, like a Venn diagram, you find all these overlays and a common core. Now you build community around that and people feel safe. And when you feel emotionally safe, you make better decisions.
Right. And I'm also thinking just the way AA transmits its program is through storytelling.
That's correct.
The same thing. Our book is called Logical Miracles. Our members not only have an opportunity to tell their own narrative, but also to hear their stories in the pages or in the rooms of our meetings where, among other things, now they don't feel so alone,
Exactly.
right? Because they've had this opportunity to share. So
It's either you and ice cream or you and a friend.
yeah, right. Right. So I would like to thank Nancy Scott and George Scott for helping us sort this out, because I know to my toes that the Suppers Programs has a future dealing with people's family narratives and their adverse childhood experiences.
Thank you.